Lambton, Kent-Middlesex.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm here today to talk about this concurrence in the report on strengthening food capacity in Canada for food security and exports. And I am also a proud member of the Agriculture Committee, and our committee does work very well together. And this was a study that we did during COVID, actually. And we heard from a lot of people across the country of challenges that we face in our agriculture sector. And I firsthand was able to travel across this country during COVID to experience what our processors were facing. And I had the opportunity to visit a couple of meat processing factories, and it struck me, Madam Speaker, at how resilient our agriculture sector is, the processing sector, but they also need a hand up sometimes, and they need some help. And we lack capacity in this country for food processing. And I'm proud to come from a region that grows fresh fruits and vegetables, an abundance of vegetables, and we grow a lot of vegetables for processing. And as a matter of fact, I have food processing in my riding in Kent County, where we process field tomatoes. And up until recently, we also had a pickling processing plant. But unfortunately, due to circumstances, that pickling processing factory closed. And it's really sad because it was a thriving business that employed a lot of people in Wallaceburg. And they tried to keep it open, but unfortunately they couldn't make it succeed. And why? Because there's policies from this government that impeded them from being able to continue business in Canada. And another example of food processing that I have in my riding is sugar beets. And 100% of the sugar beets that are grown in Southwestern Ontario are grown in Kent County and Lampton County in my riding. But they all get shipped over to Michigan to be processed. And then what happens then? It comes back to Canada, refined as sugar, and we pay a premium for that sugar, including tariffs, even though those sugar beets were grown in Ontario and are product of Canada. And I bring this up because we're seeing this more and more, Madam Speaker, where we're losing processing capacity in Canada, whether it's in the fresh food sector, whether it's the sugar beets, whether it's our oil seeds. I hear day in and day out that one of those big impediments to being able to compete in Canada is the fact that we have a carbon tax. And the carbon tax makes it more expensive for any of these processors to do business in Canada. Another example of food processing that we lose to the U.S., Madam Speaker, is pork. We have an abundance of pork producers, in my riding. And the pork gets processed, most of it at Conestoga in Kitchener, and up until recently into alumel in Quebec. But again, we don't process the value-added products in Canada. Those pork bellies get shipped down to the States where they're made into bacon, and then we import them back to Canada where we're paying a premium again on that product. And Madam Speaker, we see a plastics ban coming up. And this plastics ban that's proposed wants to eliminate plastics for all produce. Well, Madam Speaker, produce needs to be in plastic to be shipped to maintain its quality. We rely on other countries to provide 2/3 of our fresh produce in this country. And if it doesn't ship in plastic, if it's not kept wrapped, we're going to see an exorbitant amount of food waste. And not only that, we're going to lose the ability to import food in this country, putting our food security at risk. And we talk about this in this report, Madam Speaker. Food security is of utmost importance. And if we ban plastics on our produce sector in Canada, well, how are we going to get the imported food to feed Canadians that comes from all over the world? It's a global supply chain. We don't get to dictate how the packaging is done on fruits and vegetables, Madam Speaker. It's other countries that are packaging things, and we need to make sure that we're uniform, especially with our biggest trading partner, the United States. it will have serious consequences if this plastics ban goes forward on our produce industry. It's going to cost our produce farmers upwards of $6 billion to make that happen. And can you imagine what we're going to face in food security if we already have Canadians who can't feed themselves? We have 2 million Canadians using a food bank. 800,000 Canadians use a food bank in Ontario. And the prices of groceries are high right now. I can't imagine what the price is going to be when all of a sudden we have to pay up to 30% more for our fresh produce at the grocery stores. Families can't afford to eat right now. They're choosing between heating and eating. And if the prices continue to go up on food, we're going to have more and more people lined up at food banks, and that's not acceptable in this country, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the carbon tax makes everything more expensive. I'm a farmer, and I hear all the time in this House the members opposite on the government side talking about how farmers don't pay a carbon tax. Well, Madam Speaker, it's simply not true. Yes, there are things that farmers do where they don't pay taxes on their fuel, and I can name off driving a tractor in your field, putting fuel into your generator to be able to pump water for an irrigation system, or vehicles that don't use a roadway. Yes, they're exempt from the carbon tax and from taxes on their diesel fuel. But the reality is, as I am driving through the countryside on my way to Ottawa every week, and this past weekend on Sunday was no different, the farmers are out in their fields combining their corn, which is very late right now because it's so wet. And a lot of farmers don't use tractors and wagons anymore to transport their grains from the field back to the farm to the elevator. They're using transport trucks, Madam Speaker, and these transport trucks are required to pay the carbon tax for the fuel that they use. So when the trucks are paying more for fuel, of course the trucking companies are going to pass that cost on to the farmer. And most farmers are price takers, Madam Speaker, so they don't get to necessarily pass those costs on to the consumer. So what does that mean? It means that farmers are having to eat up those costs on their farm and taking it out of money that they would generate as revenue and reinvest in their farm to be purchasing more innovative equipment, state-of-the-art equipment, and for keeping their businesses in business. But instead, they have to pay more and more money in order to transport their grains from the field to the elevator. And in my region, Madam Speaker, it's been a very wet fall, and our farmers have had extremely wet conditions trying to get the crops off, and not only that, the corn is coming off the fields at a very, very high moisture content. And farmers have to dry the grain in order to keep it in the bins, because it goes for animal feed and it goes to the ethanol plant. And in order to deliver that corn to the ethanol plant, it has to be at a certain percentage. And so there is no other options for drying grain, whether it's corn, beans, wheat. There is no other commercially viable options in Canada other than propane and natural gas. If there was, I'm sure farmers would use it. But from what I've heard from farmers, we don't have an electrical grid system that could ever handle an electric grain dryer. So right now, they're forced to use propane and natural gas. And that's why Bill C-234 is so important, Madam Speaker. We need to pass that bill because farmers desperately need this relief from the carbon tax immediately. It'll have an immediate effect on food prices in the grocery stores. As a potato farmer, we used transport trucks to transport our potatoes from the field back to the wash plant. And a lot of farmers do that now. As I mentioned before, transport trucks transport most of the crops from the field back to the farm for processing. And they have to pay the carbon tax. There's no way around it. So if farmers were exempt from paying the carbon tax on drying their grain and on heating their barns, and Madam Speaker, I have 23% of Ontario's chicken in my riding. And I've been in those chicken barns where in the winter or in the summer, where the chicks, in order to keep the animals alive, it has to be kept warm. And how do you heat the barn? Natural gas or propane. There is no other commercially viable option to heat a barn. So, Madam Speaker, I implore that the Senate pass Bill C-234 and give our farmers the much-needed tax relief. And it's about food security, and that's what this report is about. It's food security. We need to ensure that our farmers can stay in business, that the next generations of farmers can stay in business, so that we can produce food that Canadians need to eat, because eating is a necessity. And we need to continue to be able to feed Canadians and the world with our nutritious Canadian food. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments?